Honourable Senators, it being 4 p.m., I must interrupt the proceedings, and pursuant to Rule 9-6, the bells will ring to call in the Senators for the taking of the deferred vote at 4:15 p.m. on the motion and amendment of the Honourable Senator Plett, seconded by the Honourable Senator Martin. The question is as follows. It was moved by the Honourable Senator Plett, seconded by the Honourable Senator Martin, that Bill C-21 be not read a third time, but that it be amended. May I dispense? Yes. All those in favour of the motion will please rise.
Senator Plett. L'Honorable Senator Carignan, CP. The Honourable Senator Martin. L'Honorable Senator Housakos. The Honourable Senator MacDonald. L'Honorable Senator Mockler. The Honourable Senator Arnot. L'Honorable Sénatrice Poirier. The Honourable Senator Seidman. L'Honorable Senator Boisvenu. The Honourable Senator Marshall. The Honourable Senator Ataullahjan. The Honourable Senator Wells. The Honourable Senator Oath. The Honourable Senator Batters.
It's not finished.
The Honourable Senator Patterson-Nunavut. The Honourable Senator Wallen. L'Honorable Senator Dechene. The Honourable Senator Richards.
Que tous ceux contre.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
The Honourable Senator Gold, PC. The Honourable Senator Harder, PC. L'Honorable Sénatrice Bellemare. The Honourable Senator Francis. L'Honorable Senator Massicotte. The Honourable Senator Jaffer. The Honourable Senator Lankin, PC. The Honourable Senator Laboucan-Benson. L'Honorable Sénatrice Moncion. L'Honorable Sénatrice Dupuis. The Honourable Senator Pate. The Honourable Senator Patterson, Ontario. The Honourable Senator Green. The Honourable Senator Cordy. L'Honorable Senateur Dalphon. The Honourable Senator Anderson. The Honourable Senator Klein. L'Honorable Sénateur Gignac. L'Honorable Senator Cormier. The Honourable Senator Galvez. The Honourable Senator Moody. The Honourable Senator Duncan. The Honourable Senator Sorensen. The Honourable Senator Deakin, Nova Scotia. The Honourable Senator Smith. The Honourable Senator Osler. The Honourable Senator Bury. The Honourable Senator Bernard. The Honourable Senator White. L'Honorable Sénatrice Gerba. The Honourable Senator Cardozo. L'Honorable Sénateur Forêt. The Honorable Senator Patton. The Honorable Senator Beam. The Honorable Senator Kucher. The Honorable Senator Yusuf. The Honorable Senator Quinn. The Honorable Senator Prosper. The Honorable Senator Black. The Honorable Senator Down. L'Honorable Sénatrice Ringuette. L'Honorable Sénatrice Petitclerc. L'Honorable Sénatrice Saint-Germain. L'Honorable Sénatrice Clément. The Honorable Senator Omidvar. The Honorable Senator McFedrin. L'Honorable Sénatrice Mégy. The Honorable Senator Hartling. The Honorable Senator Cotter. The Honorable Senator Wu. The Honorable Senator Lofreda. The Honorable Senator Coyle. The Honorable Senator Dasko. The Honorable Senator Ross. The Honorable Senator Kuzner. L'Honorable Sénateur Aucoin. The Honorable Senator Simons. The Honorable Senator Boyer. The Honorable Senator Dean. The Honorable Senator Boniface. The Honorable Senator Ravalia. The Honorable Senator Greenwood. The Honorable Senator Bussin. The Honorable Senator Deakin, Ontario. The Honorable Senator Kingston. The Honorable Senator McCallum.
All those who wish to abstain will please rise.
L'Honorable Sénatrice Werner CP.
Yeas pour 19, 19. Nays contre 66, 66. Abstentions, abstention 1, 1.
En conséquence, la motion est
Accordingly, the motion is defeated.
Ordre du jour, orders of the day. Senatrice Laboucan-Benson.
Honourable Senators, pursuant to Rule 4-13(3), I would like to inform the Senate that as we proceed with government business, the Senate will address items in the following order. Motion number 150, third reading of Bill C-21, second reading of Bill C-56, bills, reports of committee number 1, followed by the remaining items in the order that they appear on the order paper.
Government business, affaires du gouvernement. Motions, motion numéro 150.
Number 150.
On debate, Senator Gold.
Honourable Senators, I move the motion standing in my name.
It is moved by the Honourable Senator Gold, seconded by the Honourable Senator Laboucan-Benson, that pursuant to Rule 7.2, not more than a further 6 hours of debate be allocated at third reading stage of Bill C-21, dispense on the an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments. On debate, Senator Gold.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Honourable Senators, I rise to Government Motion 150, which proposes to allocate an additional 6 hours to debate Bill C-21. This bill aims to better protect Canadian communities from gun violence in all of its forms, including gangs, domestic violence, mass shootings, and suicide. It is, without exaggeration, a matter of life and death. And we have a duty to deal with it today, without delay, while studying it thoroughly.
Is vital legislation that aims to better protect Canadian communities from gun violence in all of its forms. It was a key electoral platform committed by this government. It has been a government priority throughout this mandate, and it has been thoroughly studied in both chambers of Parliament. And as such, I am now moving this motion seeking agreement on a roadmap to get Bill C-21 to the finish line at long last. Applying time allocation to an item of government business is not a decision I take lightly. This is only the second time that the government representative office has done so, and it is not our preferred way of dealing with legislation. But on occasion, it is the appropriate way, and I will explain why I believe that this is such an instance. Bill C-21 was introduced in May 2022. Excuse me, I hiccuped. Bill C-21 was introduced in May 2022, over a year and a half ago. It was extensively studied by members of Parliament, with numerous amendments proposed, some withdrawn, some defeated, some adopted. And the bill was ultimately passed by the other place in May of this year, with support from over 200 members of Parliament representing 4 different parties. We received the bill in our chamber on May the 18th. Over the course of 3 weeks in June, 8 senators spoke on debate before we referred the bill to the Committee on National Security, Defense, and Veterans Affairs. That committee studied Bill C-21 for 33 hours, over 12 meetings this fall. It heard from more than 60 witnesses and received 34 written briefs. It reported the bill back to the chamber last week unamended, although with extensive observations. And now we've been debating it at third reading for several days. Tout ça pour dire que ce projet de loi a fait l'objet d'une...
All this to say that this bill has undergone a serious review. I'd like to thank the many senators who took part, especially the members of the National Security Committee. And now, after a year of study in the other place, after 6 months of study in the Senate, and more than 2 years since an election campaign in which one of the government's main commitments was to ensure better gun control, it's high time to proceed with the final stages of the process. This is all the more true in light of the years, even decades, of hard work by victims of gun violence and by activists who have never stopped demanding concrete measures to better protect our communities.
Colleagues, we just marked December 6th, the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. On that day in 1989, 14 women were murdered at École Polytechnique in Montreal. Another 10 women and 4 men were injured. In the 34 years since, the survivors of that shooting, along with friends and family members of the victims, have been calling for legislation like Bill C-21. And during that time, they've been joined by people whose lives have been turned upside down by far too many shootings in places all across this country. And they've been joined as well by survivors of intimate partner violence and those who work with and advocate for them. They've been joined by medical professionals, from emergency room doctors to pediatricians to those who specialize in suicide prevention. They've been joined by mayors and joined by police chiefs who work every day to address the scourge of gang violence in their communities. And they've been joined by people vulnerable to, as Professor Pam Palmater described at committee, the link between hate groups and gun violence. And they were joined this fall by Brian Sweeney, whose daughter Angela was murdered in Sault Ste. Marie. Mr. Sweeney took the stage at the December 6th commemoration in Montreal last week as one of the newest members of a community of victims and community of survivors and advocates that no one wants to be part of. No one wants to be part of that community. And from the podium, he said he traveled to Montreal, and I quote, to support the other victims here that have been suffering for a lot longer than myself. And in a letter to senators about Bill C-21, he wrote this: implementing these measures is urgent. The bill is the result of years of advocacy from victims and women's groups, and women have died while the bill has been debated. End of quote. Colleagues, I would not be moving this motion for time allocation if we were at the start of the process. But at this point, the Senate has conducted a thorough and conscientious review. We've analyzed the bill from all angles. We're very well aware of all the arguments for and against. And so, after a lengthy parliamentary process and after decades of hard work by advocates, it's time to agree on a roadmap that gets us to a final vote. Pursuant to Rule 7.2, I've spoken with the Leader of the Opposition, but we have not reached an agreement to allocate time for the remainder of the debate. Accordingly, I encourage honourable senators to support this motion to allocate an additional 6 hours for the third reading debate of Bill C-21. Thank you for your kind attention.
Senator Plett.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Colleagues, Senator Gold has found in his toolbox the tool that Senator Furey left him with: the ability to use the power of the government majority to shut down debate. Don't let the form of Senator Gold's motion fool you. Chapter 7 of our rules talks about a motion to allocate time. But what we are talking about in reality is shutting down debate. Let me quote from a few good old Liberals in the good old days. Let me quote Senator Jim Cowan, who is the Leader of the Opposition. And this is what Senator Cowan said in December 2012. Some honourable senators opposite, and certainly the government, tried to say this is a process issue, not important to Canadians. And of course, the motion before us sounds dry and technical. Time allocation. Who could be interested in that? Let me tell you who is interested. The senators who wanted to add their voice to this debate and who wanted to improve the bill. The thousands of Indigenous people who were never consulted about this bill. The hundreds of thousands of law-abiding firearm owners who were constantly and are constantly being targeted by this government. The millions of Canadians who feel cheated by this move of the government to shut down debate on a bad bill. As I said, the term used in the rules of the Senate is time allocation. Since I have been here a few years, I try to remember the synonyms that were used over the years by our Liberal colleagues who were then in opposition. And I think it might help the Trudeau-appointed senators who were not here at that time to understand what time allocation really is. I think that using the words of these old Liberal senators, some of them who are still here, could convince the new Liberal senators, disguised as independents, that Senator Gold's motion is bad. What Senator Gold and the Trudeau government want to do has been described as an effort to do time allocation, do time limitation, invoke closure, curtail debate, limit debate to a maximum degree possible, cut off debate, shut down debate in Parliament, ram C-21 through and cut off debate, run shortcuts around due process, avoid careful scrutiny, silence our voices on the most critical issues facing Canadians, and slam through its agenda without listening either to Parliament or to Canadians. What Senator Gold is doing has been called undemocratic, a guillotine imposed by the government on this chamber, using power to secure more power, the muzzling of Parliament and through that of the Canadian people, an abuse of Parliament, and denying Parliament its right, our duty, to seriously examine what is proposed to be the law of the land. With Senator Gold's motion, we have been told Parliament is being emasculated, and our examination of important government legislation has been radically truncated. This is what Liberal senators said about time allocation 10 years ago or so. Let me quote again Senator Coyle when he speaks about the words time allocation. They are words used to stop debate, to kill it outright, to prevent each one of us from asking questions about the very important and complicated bill before us, to stop us from looking too closely at this government's plans for our country. To look closely is, of course, our job. It is what Canadians expect us to do, what we are paid to do, what we are summoned here to do. The use of time allocation by a leader of the government that is neither leader nor a member of the government caucus was a departing gift to the government from our former Speaker, Speaker Fury. And you all know that I have and always have had great respect for a former Speaker. One thing I will, however, remember is the level of creativity and the novelty he could bring in his April 25th decision. There are those who apply rules and those who rewrite rules. The Liberal Party of Canada is the governing party. Senator Gold is not a member of the Liberal Party. He admitted so. No matter the facts, we are told to imagine that Senator Gold is the leader of a theoretical governing party.
He is when it's convenient.
A party that exists only for the purpose of giving Senator Gold the ability to shut down debate. This ruling was wrong then and is still wrong today. It was purely a political decision. In normal circumstances, it would have been reversed by a new speaker, but we are not in normal circumstances. I understand that some of the new senators may not be familiar with the notion of time allocation or closure. You have to know, colleagues, that this place functioned for 124 years without any form of limitation on debate. It was the debate on the GST and the antics of the Liberal senators who used their right to debate the bill for weeks and weeks that convinced everyone that the government should have a tool to limit what amounts to filibuster. The overuse by Liberals of their privilege to unlimited debate was studied by the Rules Committee, which came up with what now is Chapter 7 of our rules. So the use of time allocation is a reaction to a filibuster by the opposition. Again, let me quote my friend Jim Cowan, this time from March 2012. I miss Jim Cowan. I readily acknowledge that there may be circumstances in which proceeding in this way is justified. For instance, when a deliberate filibuster drags on and on. Debate at third reading on Bill C-21 started 1 week ago, on December 6th, when the sponsor, Senator Youssef, spoke. The day after, Senator Boisvenu spoke. Then on Monday, the next sitting, Senator Carignan spoke. And then I spoke yesterday. That's hardly dragging our feet. Senator Gold then, immediately after I spoke yesterday, I'm the critic on this bill. Normally I would speak last. I offered to speak early. And I had hardly sat down in my seat. And up jumped Senator Gold to give notice of his time allocation motion. 4 senators spoke at third reading. Every sitting since the bill was introduced at third reading, there was a senator who spoke. That is no filibuster, colleagues, not by any stretch of the imagination. I will continue to quote former Liberal senators. Maybe their words will enlighten senators also appointed by a Liberal Prime Minister. This is what Senator Joan Fraser said in July 2010. There are occasions when time allocation, drastic as it may be necessary. It may be necessary on a major piece of legislation when the opposition is being obstructionist for pure obstructionist's sake. I admit our caucus has sometimes filibustered a bad bill or a motion. How can someone seriously accuse us of being obstructionists when we speak on the bill at each sitting? But then we remember that Mark Ariston accused me of holding up the bill before we even had it in the chamber. The Senate never adjourned the debate on third reading of Bill C-21. Not once. Not once. How is this a filibuster? How are we obstructionists? We never hid the fact that we do not like this bill, that we wanted to amend it thoroughly, that if the bill was not amended, we would vote against it, but we were not obstructionists in any way. I submit to you, colleagues, that this use of time allocation has one objective, and one objective only, to shut down the Senate early. It is not used to counter a filibuster. There is no filibuster. That is why the use of time allocation by the government is so outrageous and should be opposed. The other reason usually invoked for imposing the guillotine on debate is the urgency of passing a bill. I am sure that we all agree that debate should be limited when time is of the essence. If a legislature is called upon to pass a bill to stop a strike in a hospital, for instance, where patients are in danger, it is easy to understand that it is fair to put parameters on the duration of the debate. But there is no urgency in the case of C-21. This bill in its current form, or tabled in previous parliaments, has been around for years. And then Public Safety Minister, or Public Safety Disaster, as some like to call him, Marco Mendocino, amended the bill and then rejected his own amendments. The legislative process of this bill will become a classic story of what not to do for future generations of parliamentary assistants. C-21 may be important to the Prime Minister. C-21 may be important for some Canadians. But C-21 is not urgent. If it had been urgent, do you think the government would have left it laying in the House of Commons for a year, doing nothing with it? The essence of Bill C-21 merely confirms orders in council that have already been enacted by the government. That is the case with the ban on the purchase and sale of handguns. And it is the case in relation to the expanded definition of prohibited firearms. Even the so-called red flag provisions in the bill duplicate powers that the police and chief firearms officers already possess. Because this bill is not urgent, the use of time allocation by the government should be opposed. As I said before, Senator Gold gave his notice that he intends to vote time allocation. Only 4 senators had spoken at third reading. This means that 90, yes, colleagues, 90 senators have not yet spoken to this bill. With only 6 hours of debate left, that means that at least 66 senators will be deprived of their right to speak. With this motion, Senator Gold is telling at least 66 of his colleagues that the government has absolutely no interest in listening to what they have to say. As the then Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Senator Plett Tardif said in 2012, I find it hard to believe that members of this government, who proudly boast that they defend freedom of expression, would use any means available to them to limit opposition senators' right to speak. I have a question for the Trudeau-appointed senators who are ready to give Senator Gold the hammer to shut down debate on C-21. When the Prime Minister called you to announce your appointment to the Senate of Canada, did he tell you that on the whim of the government leader, you would have to hold your nose and shut down debate after 4 days of debate on a bill? Did he mention that he would gladly use the good old tools of the past to silence the opposition? That he would do, with your help, what he and his Liberal senators were denouncing when the Conservative government was doing it? This is what is asked from you today. Senator Gold is telling us, I don't care what senators have to say. The government wants this bill now, and we have to bow to the Prime Minister's wishes. I have given you several quotes from the ghosts of the Liberal past. Let me now quote a senator who ended his Senate career as a member of the PSG in 2012, Senator Dennis Dawson.
Honourable Senators, it is now 6 o'clock, and pursuant to Rule 3-31, I am obliged to leave the chair until 8 o'clock, when we will resume, unless it is your wish, Honourable Senators, to not see the clock. Is it agreed to not see the clock? No. I hear a no. Honourable Senators, leave was not granted, and the sitting is therefore suspended, and I will leave the chair until 8 p.m. Resumed. Senator Plett.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I think this is where I left off, that I was just saying I had given you several quotes from ghosts of the Liberal Senate past, and I now wanted to give you a quote from a senator who ended his career here with the PSG in 2012, and that's Senator Dawson. And Senator Dawson said, "Parliamentarians are supposed to debate the government's proposed legislation. They are not supposed to rubber stamp measures proposed by public servants or the executive. They are supposed to carefully consider the measures, talk about them, amend them, study them, and ensure that taxpayers' concerns have been fully expressed." What Senator Gold is doing here tonight is ramming C-21 through and cutting off debate, and this is an affront to our job as senators. We are not here to govern. We are here to hold to account those who do. But to do that, we need the ability to debate legislation and to propose amendments. Senator Gold's motion would not only restrict our ability to debate, it means none of you can present amendments. I repeat, the government is doing that while 90 senators have not spoken to the bill. 90 senators are stripped of their right to present an amendment. 90 senators no longer have the ability to try to improve this flawed bill. Not only does time allocation take away the right of senators to speak on this bill, it silences the voices of all those whom the government failed to consult. If we vote in favor of this motion and allow it to pass, then we are complicit with the government's clear intent to silence those who need to be heard. Colleagues, as you know, stakeholders cannot walk into this chamber and make their view known. We are to represent them. We are required to protect the voices of Canadians who would otherwise not be heard. And today, that is gun owners. Whether you agree with this bill or not, you should support the right of stakeholders to be heard. But this motion removes that. It silences all those voices before they are even heard. Senator Boisvenu put it well when he said, "I will address one of the most obvious things that's missing from the current version of Bill C-21. Something that's at the root of all problems with this bill. This flaw is due to the fact that the government held almost no consultations while drafting this bill." Senator Boisvenu went on to give example after example of the government's failure to consult. The Indigenous people were not consulted. Pond Erngut, Vice President of Nunavut Tungavut Incorporated, said, "We understand that Inuit, Teperit, Kanatami, the National Inuit Organization, commonly known as ITK, had received a briefing of the most recent version of the bill shortly before it was tabled in May. However, neither ITK nor NTI has been fully consulted on the language that impacts this bill." Jessica Lazar, Chief of the Mohawk Council of Kanawaki, said, "We only had one meeting, and that wasn't necessarily an adequate consultation, so I wouldn't consider it consultation whatsoever." The government also failed to consult with sport shooters. Sandra Honor, Chair of the Board of Directors of the Shooting Federation of Canada, said, "The Shooting Federation of Canada was not asked to participate in the committee that discussed Bill C-21. Nor did we have letters answered to us after we wrote the minister several times to request. I have no confidence in the minister." We heard yesterday from Senator Dechene. She all of a sudden renewed her confidence in the minister that he promised her something. He promised us that he had consulted. Gilbert White, chairperson of the Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation Recreational Firearm Community, said the Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation was not consulted. When asked if his organization had been consulted, Doug Chazon, Executive Director of Fur Institute of Canada, said, "No, we were not." Colleagues, the list goes on. The views of Canadians impacted by this legislation were not sought, and when they spoke up, to say no, they were shut out. By cutting off debate, we are silencing them once again. Let me quote once again the then leader of the opposition at the time, the member of Justin Trudeau Liberal Caucus, Jim Cowan, in March of 2012. We know that this bill is contentious. We have all received hundreds of emails and other communications from very concerned Canadians asking us, pleading us to reflect carefully on the proposals in this bill. How insulting to these people to then invoke closure, to shut down debate, to limit it to the maximum degree possible, and to do so immediately. Colleagues, you have no idea of how many emails we have received asking us to do exactly the same thing. This applies perfectly here with Bill C-21. In 2016, we heard over and over how Trudeau senators are independent. And yet their voting record, 96% of the time with the government, but they are independent. They sponsor government legislation, but they are independent. The vote on this motion will be another test of this independence. We have to remember, colleagues, that debate is not simply trying to convince one another to vote a certain way. Debate is part of a process of ensuring that before we make a final decision on a bill, that we have fully considered the issue, that we have taken the time to listen and consider all voices on the issue, not just those that agree with us. The government has not done that, and now through this motion, the government wants to prevent us from doing that. That is unfortunate. The Senate of Canada serves an integral component of the nation's legislative process, with one of its key roles being the representative of marginalized, underrepresented voices. This function is crucial in ensuring a comprehensive and inclusive approach to governance. The Senate acts as a platform where interests and concerns of minority groups, individuals in remote or less populated regions, and those whose voices are often overlooked in the political arena are brought to the forefront. The importance of this role cannot be overstated. In a diverse country like Canada, there are a myriad of perspectives and issues that may not always find adequate representation in the more politically driven House of Commons. The Senate's mandate to listen and give voice to these less heard segments of the population is a cornerstone of its existence. The process of consultation is vital in this context. The Senate's effectiveness in representing these groups hinges on its ability to actively engage with them, understand their concerns, and reflect these in the legislative process. Through consultations, the Senate gathers insights and viewpoints that are essential in crafting laws and policies that are equitable and inclusive. Believe it or not, colleagues, this role of the Senate of Canada becomes particularly significant in the context of debates like gun control, where diverse viewpoints need to be heard and considered. Gun control is a contentious issue in Canada, encompassing a wide range of perspectives from public safety concerns to the rights of gun owners. While the primary focus often lies on enhancing public safety and reducing gun violence, it is essential to recognize that lawful gun owners also represent a significant segment of the Canadian populace. These individuals include hunters, sport shooters, and rural residents for whom firearms are part of their lifestyle and culture. Whether you agree with them or not, the Senate's role in representing gun owners is vital by ensuring that their voices and concerns are heard in the legislative process. The Senate contributes to a more balanced and comprehensive discussion. This motion to cut off debate strikes to the core of the Senate's role to represent the voices of the unheard. This is regrettable, colleagues. We should not approve this. And let me just reflect for a few moments. I think I have a few moments left. You know, the fact that we got this bill as late as we did is not our fault. It's the government's fault. They didn't give us the opportunity. We are going to receive a few more bills this week. We don't know when because the government leader doesn't know when. Today and the other place, we are waiting for a bill right in this chamber, the Ukraine-Canada Free Trade Agreement, that we don't have. Our government leader says we have to pass that before we go home for Christmas. We don't have the bill. Today, when the government had the opportunity to present that bill, what did they do? They called C-58, the scab workers legislation, to send it to committee, to sit at committee till February when they come back and do nothing. instead of bringing C-57, the Ukraine-Canada Free Trade Agreement, to the forefront so we could have it? What's going to happen at the end of the week when we receive that bill and we want to do proper debate and we want to send it to committee? We're going to have the government leader say, no, we're out of here next week, Wednesday, and I'm going to do time allocation. He's going to come in here. I spoke to the leader of the opposition, and I told him I was doing time allocation. Not I consulted, I told him I was going to do time allocation. These people over in the other place, this government can't organize a two-car parade over there, and then they send this to us on their way out the door, which is what's going to happen, colleagues. They're going for Christmas on Friday. Trust me. And they're going to send it on the way out the door. Senate, deal with it. Government leader is going to say, we're not going home until we deal with it. Can you give me leave? I have a feeling my friends over in the far corner, where they're hard to recognize some days, are going to say, no, we're not giving leave. So there we are. I would give leave, I know that, but they won't. So there we are. We're going to have to be here. And then we're going to have time allocation. And we're going to cut off debate. And Canadians won't have the right. Colleagues, we heard earlier today when this bill came to us, and let me just refresh your memory on when we got this bill. On June 21st, received the bill on May 18th. Senator Youssef spoke May 31st. I spoke June 21st, 3 weeks later. There was, I think, 8 speakers in between. First committee meeting on October 4th. Of course, June 21st, we went home for the summer break. October 4th, we came back. Consideration of a draft agenda. We went through the committee meetings as per agreed with the entire committee. We weren't holding anything up. Yeah, we presented amendments, but we had all the committee meetings. We decided December 4th, I think was the date that we agreed. The 5th is when it was brought into the chamber for the report. Senator Youssef spoke the 6th. And here we are, the 15th. I spoke yesterday. And like I say, my seat, I wasn't in my seat when Senator Gold jumped up, and I'm now doing time allocation. Cutting off every opportunity. I am beside myself with trying to work with this government to try to pass legislation, or move legislation forward, not pass legislation, but move legislation forward, that the people in the other place cannot organize. They can't get us legislation. This bill languished in the other place for a year, colleagues, for a year. This is not a money bill. Nobody's going to go hungry at Christmas time if this bill isn't passed. We all know that in due course, the government members, 60-some or 70-some government members here in this chamber, are going to pass this bill. We understand that, and we accept 55. We accept that. But why the hurry? What's going to happen if we come back February 5th and we continue another couple of weeks of debate on this bill? The government can do everything through regulation. They're already doing it. They can continue to do all of it through regulation, but no, we're being forced. We're being told, cut off debate. And then the leader says, we have done thorough debate. How is that thorough debate? I think there are 4 speakers tonight. 4 speakers tonight on at least so far, that would like to speak to the main bill when we have our 6 hours later on sometime, and maybe more. But they have to do it tonight because debate has been cut off. So now they have to get their comments on record. It's just unfair, and this has happened before. As Senator Gold said, this is the 2nd time in this particular government's history here that they have done time allocation. The last one was done with no consultation with the opposition, none. And the Speaker devised a way of calling Senator Gold the leader of the government. He refuses to accept that styling. He says, I am not the leader of the government. And yet he has to be, in order to do what he did tonight, Madam Speaker, in order to do what Senator Gold is doing tonight. I challenge you, Madam Speaker, to ask this leader to at least admit that he is the leader of the government. He is the leader of a registered party. He is the leader of the Liberal government of Canada. If he wants to do this, if he does that, if he stands in this chamber, Madam Speaker, and says, I am the leader of the Liberal government, and I invoke closure, I will vote for it.
To be or not to be.
I will vote for it.
Hear, hear.
But he won't do that. He won't do that. Why? He's embarrassed. I would be embarrassed too. I wouldn't want to call myself the leader of that government either.
That's true.
I wouldn't want to do that. I'm proud to be the leader of the Conservative caucus. Proud.
Senator Gold, that's true.
Madam Speaker, I am going to ask at the end that we certainly vote against this. I would like to ask you to rule against it, but I suppose I could have started my speech in a different manner if I wanted to do that. But I do challenge you, and I challenge everybody in this place, to ask the honourable senator to call himself what he needs to be in order to move this. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Hear, hear.
Senator Harder.
Would the honourable senator take a question?
Certainly.
I know it's a very short time left, but in the 4 years of the last government, last majority government, how many times was time allocation invoked?
In government.
Senator Plett.
Many times. I think if you had paid any attention to my speech, you would have heard how many times Senator Cowan had said we had done it. I have no issue. I said here, Senator Harder, I will support it if he admits who he is.
Be transparent.
He has every right, if he is the leader of the government, to invoke time allocation. He doesn't admit that he's the leader of the government.
Yeah.
24 times, by the way, colleagues. How many amendments were introduced and accepted in that government?
Right, we have direct communication.
We were part of the caucus. Like, I'm not sure where you're going with that.
Did you want 5 more minutes?
5 more minutes?
No. It's allocation.
Senatrice Saint-Germain.
Senator Saint-Germain. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Colleagues.
Or the issues of Bill C-21. The debate has happened and will continue to happen for an additional 6 hours in accordance to the motion if passed. I, however, take this opportunity to highlight the many senators who have spoken on the bill in favor or against. I will simply explain also why the time allocation motion brought forward by the government representative is warranted and needed at this stage and at this time. J'estime que le projet de loi
Bill C-21 has been studied in depth for almost 2 years within Parliament, and it is acceptable to establish a limit and circumscribe the debate on this bill. Without the exceptional use of time allocation by this government, which, as Senator Gold said, is being used for only the second time since 2015. I fear that this bill will be the target of tactics to block its adoption. Reassure me, Senator Carignan, because I am very afraid.
For the summer, we were then on June 24, 2014. The Conservative government managed to pass their 75th motion since they were in power on time allocation. And so 75, and I look at the issue of our debates, June 29, 2012. Time allocation has then been used 7 times in the past 7 months. This is 1 time allocation per month. So I do believe that the House of Commons has also studied very thoroughly this Bill C-21. It was introduced in the other place on May
30, 2022, so 1 year, over 1 year and 7 months ago. It proceeded to the different steps at the House for around 1 year and was adopted at third reading in May 2023 when we received it. 18 meetings of the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security took place in order to study the bill between October 2022 and May 2023. At third reading vote, the bill had the support of the Liberals, the Bloc, the NDP, and the Greens. That is a majority of the elected parliamentarians. In the Senate now, the bill was also studied thoroughly in the Senate. It was received in May 2023. It was debated at 6 different sittings at second reading. The Standing Senate Committee on National Security, Defense, and Veteran Affairs had 12 meetings on C-21, where they have heard from 66 witnesses. The witnesses included the Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions and Intergovernmental Affairs, federal officials from relevant departments and agencies, academic, researchers, and individuals appearing on their own behalf, selected provincial chief firearm officers, and representatives of advocacy groups, non-government organizations, indigenous organizations, and governments, as well as law enforcement agencies. The committee also received 34 briefs from organizations and individuals, some of whom did not appear as witnesses. We are today at our 5th day debating this bill at third reading. Colleagues, I believe we can say without doubt that this bill has received so far the necessary amount of scrutiny and sober second thought. Every senator has had the time and the opportunity, if he, she so wishes, to hear from others and look at this bill to make their own idea on the content and how they should vote. Salisbury Convention, a few words on it. Firearms regulations have been part of the electoral platform of the Liberal Party since their accession to government in 2015. It was also a key part of their electoral platform for the 2019 and 2021 federal elections. It is part of a multiple-layered approach, which has included a buyback program for firearms owners and previous bills, Bill 71, which received Royal Assent on June 21, 2019. As such, we are in a situation in which the Salisbury Convention clearly applies. It is our duty to consider the will of the elected chamber. Now, a few words on the political context surrounding Bill C-21. The Conservative Party has expressed a strong opposition to Bill C-21, both in the House and in the Senate. They have promised to delay this bill, which is part of the government platform and supported by all other parties, as I've already demonstrated in the other place, at all cost. In his speech at second reading on June 21, 2023, Senator Plett, the leader of the Conservatives in the Senate, made it perfectly clear. I quote him, "Having personally reviewed the very negative implications of this bill, I wish to say that since the last speaker in this chamber spoke on the bill literally 2 minutes ago, I have now officially begun to delay Bill C-21. So let there be no question, and let the minister know, so the minister and his parliamentary secretary can mark that in their calendars for future reference." End of quote. Conclusion. As such, colleagues, I believe that a time allocation motion is the only common sense solution for Bill C-21 to see the light of a third reading vote in the Senate. This motion, as well as this bill finally getting to a vote at third reading, is in the interest of Canadians. It is the will of the elected House and the wish of the Canadian people. Status quo is no longer sustainable. Let's vote for respecting the democratic process and vote for motion 150. Thank you. Merci. Niguch.
Senator Carignan. Senator Carignan. Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a motion that I know well. Honourable Senators, I would like to rise on the time allocation motion tabled by the government. This motion is based on the Section 7 of the Rules, 7.2, which states that the leader or the deputy leader of the government can at any time announce that the representatives of the recognized parties have been in agreement to reach or on other government business. The use of this rule was used little in recent years, but it should be properly explained to our many new colleagues who are now in this chamber. In the volume entitled The Senate in Practice 2015, there's a very clear definition, and I quote, setting time allocation is used to circumscribe the time allocated for discussing government legislation. Only the government can set time allocation, and only for its own business, end of quote. So in sum, when the government wants to set a limit on a study in the Senate, it usually tries to negotiate with the recognized parties to arrive at an agreement that will allow them to wrap up their work and to allow the Senate to truly play its role of sober second thought. You know, Senators, the specificity of the Senate is to offer a chamber of reflection, not entirely exempt of partisan games, but they are much less present than any other place. Generally speaking, the government offers forums of exchange, whether it's in the chamber itself or at committees, and we are good at playing our role of sober second thought. That is the reason why the organization of our work is normally done by consensus, where each group finds a space to set their priorities. The Senate has a number of characteristics that distinguish it from the other place, which mean that it is a place where exchanges are generally more calm, where our studies are more in-depth. I like to say that our way of working is more based on an assembly. This study of Bill C-45, an act on a cannabis act, and an act to amend other drugs and certain drugs and substances, passed in the Senate on June 7th, 2018, was a good example of a respectful study by all senators. Do you recall, Senators, for those who were here, how this bill stirred up passions? The consensus among Canadians, Canadians were very polarized, and that was reflected in the Senate. It was a bill that would profoundly change Canadian case law on the legalization of cannabis, and yet the Senate organized its work in a very civilized way, setting days for specific issues like youth, mental health, the economy, the black market, and so on. All the leaders of the different political parties represented in the Senate agreed on the procedure to be followed. That is when the government, and only the government, can table a time allocation motion to circumscribe debate on a government bill. In page 109, you can read this, and I quote, setting a deadline on something which is debated under government business on the orders of the day. A debate on the motion is no longer than 2.5 hours, and after that it is put to a vote. There you have it, colleagues, the framework for a time allocation motion. In my opinion, it should be used sparingly. It should be used to get over a procedural impasse and not to sidestep the debates of senators who have important things to say. As government leader of the Senate, I used this measure, but I never abused it. because, let's be honest, it is drastic and limits debate of senators, which is usually not desirable in our chamber. I'll just have a little sip here. When I presented these motions, how did the official opposition react, composed of Liberals who were still welcome within the Liberal Party at that time? Allow me to cite Senator Claudette Tardif, who said in 2013, as deputy leader of the Liberal caucus in the Senate, this is from 2013 about time allocation. From now on, the government is using all of its weight to impose sanctions on this time allocation motion. It wishes to withdraw senators' right to debate. We will not be able to do our sober second thought with these constraints imposed upon us by this government. I hope that senators on the other side will carefully examine the time allocation motion being applied today. I believe that by choosing to act in this way, the government is harming the institution that we represent. I must oppose this time allocation motion, and I would encourage all senators to do the same. End of quote.
Honourable colleagues, I have the following question for you under Bill C-21. Is this issue so serious that, as Senator Tardif said, we should take away senators' rights to express their views, prevent senators from doing the work that Canadians expect us to do? At the beginning of my speech, I said that this time allocation motion should be used sparingly, but I'm saying that in this case it isn't the case. And several people before the committee said that they had some comments to make about Bill C-21. Before the committee, I put forward a number of amendments that would certainly have improved the bill. But the non-conservative senators there completely rejected those amendments. It is troubling to think that independent senators should all be thinking in the same way. In light of this finding, I had another thought. When I saw that the government was going to try to impose time allocation to have this passed, a government that uses a tool such as this one has the certainty that the motion will be able to be passed. But today, how can the government have that certainty in trying to pass this type of a motion? And moreover, why? This motion is completely useless. Only a handful of senators wanted to make comments, and I'd bet that the 6-hour debate will last at most 1 or 2 hours, which shows that this is an abusive use of the motion. Leader, I would say that this is like basically banging down the door rather than just using the door handle to open it. And this is, I think, an abusive use of this motion because clearly the ensuing debate will not last 6 hours, but rather 1 to 2 hours, showing the futility of this motion. Thank you, senators.
Senator, prepared to take a question?
Bien sûr.
Of course.
As the author of 24 time allocations, perhaps you could remind everybody here of the time you introduced time allocation at the same time the bill was introduced.
Je suis tellement heureux que vous me posez cette...
In fact, I'm so pleased to receive this question from you. And I see Senator Hanguet expressing her views with much emotion and energy. If you'll allow me, I do have to answer this question. I'd ask for an extra minute. granted? Yes. I would remind you that at the time, there were some rascals among the Liberals, and they would enjoy getting to the time allocation motion stage to somehow claim that mean Prime Minister Harper was authoritarian and non-democratic, and that is precisely why there were so many time allocation motions, and that was my colleagues Cohen, Tardif, Faringuet, Fraser's colleagues' approach.
Dancing lessons from Senator Plett.
The time is
Senator Carignan, you actually have 10 seconds to respond.
J'ai mal à la gorge.
My throat.
Senator MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Colleagues, I rise to speak on the government's motion to impose time allocation cutting off debate on C-21. Before I go to my prepared remarks, I want to say a few words about, I guess, gun issues in general. I'm a person that's never had much interest in guns. I grew up in a house where there was always the same 4 guns, a .32 Special, a rifle, a 12 gauge, a 16 gauge, and a 22. My father hunted. One of my brothers hunted. I was never interested in hunting. The first time I went after animals of any sort, I was 10 years old. My grandfather taught me how to tie rabbit snares. And that was great until the day I went out and found a couple of rabbits in the snares with their eyes popping out, their tongue hanging out, and that was enough for me for rabbit hunting. And then my father took me out hunting one time. I was about 12, and a big, beautiful buck came out in the clearing, and I screeched. The buck took off, and that was the last time my father took me hunting. I was never much for shooting animals or hunting, but I had a lot of friends that hunted, and I like venison. If people show up to venison, I was more than willing to eat it. My father knew how to prepare venison, so I'm not against hunting. I'm not against people managing long guns and handling long guns. I remember back in the 90s when Alan Rock was with the Chrétien government. They brought in the gun registry. We were told, we were assured it was going to cost $2 million. It cost $2 billion. And we know what it accomplished. It accomplished absolutely nothing. Just a big, expensive bureaucracy that accomplished nothing but pick on lawful gun owners. We also know that we're susceptible to media. We see some of the extreme things that occur in the U.S., but we have a different gun culture in Canada than we have in the U.S. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I think we should respect that gun culture. I think it's been we're fairly modest when it comes to dealing with these issues. So I have no stake in gun issues because I have no interest in guns. Guns for me have been, I put guns in the same category as motorcycles and skydiving. I just as soon avoid them. So it's just not something I'm interested in. But I am interested in treating people properly and law-abiding citizens properly. And I do know that, we've in this country, in terms of handguns, we've had regulations and registration of handguns since the 1930s. So we've always been fairly responsible when it came to handguns. And we also know that in this country, 96% of the firearm-related charges that were laid against unlicensed criminals were for the illegal possession of firearms. It was always unlicensed criminals with illegal firearms. And we know that almost 96% of the handguns, the illegal handguns in this country, are brought across the Canada-U.S. border. So I'm not sure what this stuff is going to solve, but it is certainly, I think it's very unfair to the law-abiding gun owners of this country. So we see the government bringing up time allocation. I guess I am disappointed but not particularly surprised with this motion, since it is perfectly in keeping with how the government has approached this entire bill. The Senate committee reviewing this bill met for 12 meetings, heard from dozens of witnesses, most of whom opposed the bill, and many of whom suggested important amendments. Yet not one amendment was supported by the government majority in this committee. The entire review of Bill C-21 in committee turned out to be a little more than a sham. The witnesses who took the time to appear, who offered detailed proposals for amendments, fundamentally wasted their time. And now the government is imposing time allocation. That means that important issues that have not yet been touched on by this chamber in relation to the bill will simply be ignored. So I want to touch on just one of those issues. Those concern the so-called red flag provisions in the bill. The red flag provisions in Bill C-21 will permit any individual to make an application to a court for an emergency firearm prohibition order to immediately remove firearms for up to 30 days from any individual who they believe may pose a danger to themselves or to others in the public. It also permits an application to be made for the removal of firearms from an individual who they believe may be at risk of providing access to firearms to another person who is already subject to a firearms prohibition order. So what does this provision actually add to the current law? This is something that we as senators should actually take the time to understand. The reality is that, as witnesses at committee stated, the police already have full authority to remove firearms from any individual whom they believe may pose a public safety threat. And the police can do this without issuing a warrant. Right now, any individual has the ability to call the police or the chief firearms officer of their province and raise public safety concerns. The police or the CFO then responds to those concerns. The government argues that these new provisions in Bill C-21 will add another tool to the toolbox, enabling citizens to go to the courts if they so choose. But we really need to ask ourselves, who's going to take days, weeks, or months to go to the court? They can just call the police. We are told there are certain circumstances where the police may not act. They may reject complaints that have been made by neighbors. In those circumstances, where there has been a police investigation, and where the police have talked to the person concerned and to his family or her family, we are to believe that then reasonable people will decide to go to court instead of relying on what the police have found. But if we're going to be honest with ourselves, such cases will likely be few and very far between. And legitimate cases may in fact be practically non-existent. So this provision then gives rise to new concerns. The criminal justice section of the Canadian Bar Association has argued the following, and I quote, "The current law contains sufficient powers to accomplish the goal of seizing weapons believed to have been used in a crime or removing them from the hands of persons who are believed to be a danger to themselves or others." The criminal justice section of the Bar Association, and I quote, says, "They believe the proposed amendments included in Bill C-21 pose a threat to public safety and a disproportionate risk to marginalized groups." Tim Thurley, a firearms researcher and policy specialist who appeared before the committee, made a similar point, and I quote him, "The ill-considered red flag proposals are problematic. Under Canada's existing licensing system, police and judges already have the power to remove guns and revoke licenses from those who pose a threat. The new provisions have no requirements to consider Indigenous hunting rights, for the complainant to have any relationship to the accused, or for the accused to be heard in court. Indigenous people are disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system and are also the most reliant on firearms for subsistence. We will undermine the built-in safeguards of the existing red flag law. Where people hunt to feed their families, this has real consequences." Noah Schwartz, assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of the Fraser Valley, noted that, and I quote him, "This new change would allow for ex parte revocations, which means that an accusation could be made by someone who doesn't even know the person they are accusing. They might not have ever met them in real life. There would be no way for the accused to know who is making the accusation." Close quotes. Nathan Oped, president of Inuit Taparit Katanami, echoed the same concerns when he testified before our committee. And Chief Jesse Lazar of the Kanawaki Mohawk said, "In terms of red flag and yellow flag provisions, we do have concerns regarding the anonymous tip kind of approach, where this could be a potential for racial discrimination." Close quotes. Serious concerns have been raised about the constitutionality of these provisions in Bill C-21. An amendment was therefore proposed in committee to narrow the scope of these provisions to enable immediate family, persons residing with an individual, police and health professionals to make such an ex parte application. All other complaints will be made, as they are today, to the police or to the chief firearms officer. However, the amendment was rejected by the government majority, meaning that these witnesses' concerns have all been ignored. So now, in the red flag section of the bill, I believe that at a minimum, we have a provision that is unlikely to be used, except perhaps by angry neighbors who cannot get a response to their liking from the police or don't particularly like their neighbors. And at worst, the provision will pose yet another burden on our already overloaded courts and perhaps even found to be unconstitutional. This is a concerning component of the bill, but it is hardly the worst part of the bill. Yet we have not discussed this matter in this chamber at all. And now, because of time allocation, there will be no opportunity to do so. I suppose that means that the majority of government senators are continuing to...
Sorry to interrupt. The time for debate has expired. That's correct.
I don't think you should support this. Thank you.
Senator Ataullahjan.
Thank you, Speaker. Colleagues, I rise to speak in opposition to the government's motion to introduce time allocation on Bill C-21. The more one looks at the actual provisions of Bill C-21, the more one realizes how many issues have been given short shrift in the Senate's review of this legislation. One major issue that has been ignored is the total inadequacy of the current bill when it comes to the spike in violent crime, and in particular gun crime, that is plaguing some of our most vulnerable communities. As a Toronto senator, I have seen the horrendous rise in gun violence. I have been asked repeatedly by community members who worry about their friends and family what is being done to protect their loved ones. In fact, I was at a community event this weekend, and the one thing everyone was talking about is how unsafe they're feeling in their homes. And they're saying, what are we going to do, and what are you guys prepared to do? We have already had some idea about the government's ill-considered measures in Bill C-5 and Bill C-75 have ensured a spike in violent crime in urban Canada. We know, for example, that under Bill C-5, the government repealed several mandatory sentences for gun crime, including using a firearm or imitation firearm in the commission of an offense, possession of a firearm or weapon knowing its possession is unauthorized, possession of a prohibited or restricted firearm with ammunition, possession of a weapon obtained by commission of offense, discharging a firearm with intent, robbery with a firearm, and extortion with a firearm. The government argued that some of these specific measures related to bail and would, and I quote, ensure that the release at the earliest opportunity is favored over detention, end quote. The impact of this has been nothing short of devastating. In British Columbia, one study examined 425 bail hearings involving a suspect accused of a violent crime with a breach of bail conditions on their file. Of those 425 hearings, the Crown sought detention orders in only 222 cases, or 52% of the time. That meant that in nearly 50% of the cases, violent criminals with bail breaches on their files were back on the streets. My province of Ontario has experienced a 57% increase in serious violence and weapons cases before the courts between 2018 and 2021. There's no question in my mind that our courts are already overburdened, and some cases are often years behind in being heard. For example, the Toronto Police Service reports that in the last 2 years, 17% of accused in Toronto charged with shooting-related homicides were already out on bail at the time of the alleged fatal shooting. Therefore, every decision we take in this chamber matters. It will have a ripple effect throughout the country and impact the communities we live in. When we pass legislation that's ill-considered, it's the Canadian communities, and often the most vulnerable in those communities who suffer the most. And now the government is intent on doing that once again by cutting off debate on Bill C-21. However, I believe that the fact that the Standing Senate Committee on National Security, Defense and Veterans Affairs dedicated 12 meetings to this bill is indicative that we too must be diligent in our debates. Senators, we're here to debate and to listen to each other's views, whether we agree or disagree. Honourable colleagues, I urge you to reject this motion, if only to ensure that vulnerable communities do not pay the price of a speedy adoption of Bill C-21. You only have to look at cities like Mississauga and Brampton, where people are feeling unsafe in their homes, where we're having home invasions and guns are used, people are being pistol whipped, and the fear is real. I worry when my own daughters go out to Toronto. I worry what they're going to be facing because there's so many shootings. And, young people, they go to clubs. We can't stop them. And I am up the whole night until they don't get back home. So for some of us, especially parents in Mississauga and Brampton who have spoken to me, this fear is real. Thank you.
Senator Housakos.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, colleagues. This debate is far deeper than just the motion of the time allocation. And Senator Ataullahjan, you're absolutely right. We come here to debate ideas, at times controversial ideas, and that is the role of Parliament in a democracy. And we're not here just to hear each other's point of views, but we have to particularly hear the point of view of the minority. And that is the role of this chamber. It's the constitutional role of this chamber. It's the role of Parliament. And whenever, and it's only natural, colleagues, and it's not new to this government. Of course, this Trudeau government has taken it to new heights. But governments of all ilks and all colors look at Parliament as an obstacle, as a problem to their hurry to get to their finish line of their agenda. It doesn't matter if they're liberal or conservatives. I always say that prime ministers always have a use for Parliament when they're in opposition. As soon as they become prime minister, it seems to take a more of a backroom seat. And that goes to the principle of course, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But this is when the Senate and the House of Commons kicks in. And it's at those moments when it's incumbent on us to hold the government to account and to reel them in. And of course, the House of Commons has a particular role in our democracy because they're the elected chamber, the chamber of confidence. But even this chamber of sober second thought, had a significant role to play in reeling back governments that got carried away with themselves. And they played that role of sober second thought. And many were hopeful that this new independent Senate would take it even a step further, but it's unfortunate. Independence to this government seems to have been extricating the authority of senators in this chamber from Parliament. And I remind people, as much as we've gone through this Trudeau experiment of independent Senate, the truth of the matter is, until we change the Constitution, Canada is still a bicameral, British parliamentary, Westminster-based system. We have two chambers in our Parliament. The roles are a little bit different. They're nuanced. But everyone keeps talking about the Salisbury Convention, which is great. And again, one day probably when I'm sitting back on the other side of government, I'll be referring to the Salisbury Convention as well. But I remind senators who have been here only for a few years, above and beyond the Salisbury Convention, to read Section 18 of the Constitution, which actually defines our role when we're summoned here. And Section 18 of the Constitution of Canada makes it clear that both chambers, the House of Commons and the Senate, are modeled after the House of Commons of Westminster. And each parliamentarian in the Parliament of Canada, House and Senate, have the same rights and privileges as Section 18 of the Constitution as the chamber of the House of Commons in Westminster, which ultimately means you have the obligation to hold the government to account, you have the obligation to be a voice for the regions and the constituents and stakeholders of the country, the regions you represent. And the truth of the matter is, over the last 8 years, and it was intentional, the once important role of senators, all of you. And we might have the debate, and some of you say you're not as liberal as we say, and I say you're not as independent as you proclaim. One thing there is no doubt about: each and every one of you are very accomplished, competent people from various walks of life in various regions of the country who have big things to offer this Parliament. And for the last 8 years, you've been denied that fundamental right in Section 18 of the Constitution by this government and this Prime Minister, when he refuses to allow you to be the voice of your region and your skill set and your experience in the national governing cabinet. And there was a point in time between when I got here, Senator Harder, you asked a legitimate question, why were there so few amendments in the last parliament, in the 4 parliaments previous? And that's because each and every one of the senators that were appointed this chamber, the most important role we had was not sitting at National Caucus, was not sitting here. For me, the most important role I had is sitting on ministerial advisory committees, Senator Harder. Because I sat on various committees in the Senate. I had an opportunity to engage in debate here, but the floor when we were in government was dominated by the Liberal opposition. That's how it should be. Where we as government members of the Senate, where we had our say, was at the ministerial advisory tables, when legislation was being crafted. That's when our opinions were being asked and being voiced at, even before that legislation got to National Caucus. And then when it got to National Caucus, let me tell you, all my colleagues here weren't shy to speak for the interest of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and Ontario and very often Quebec whenever the government wouldn't listen. And there's a lot of expertise in this place that would save this current government a lot of grief if many of you had a voice at those ministerial tables when legislation is being crafted. Many of you would be able to save them from a lot of embarrassment. Many of your opinions would be worth gold for this government if once a week you were allowed to express some of those opinions at National Caucus. There was once upon a time there were government leaders in this place that sat in cabinets, some even as ministers at various cabinet levels, which Senator Gold, based on the questions we ask on a daily basis, self-admittedly, we get the impression you're not consulted that often. They can benefit from much of your wisdom, Senator Gold.
C'est vrai.
C'est absolument vrai. So the problem and the exception I take is the amount of contempt that I've seen from this Prime Minister and this government towards this institution, towards the senators they've appointed. And they're always spending a lot of time trying to convince you how legislation has to pass quickly because it's imperative. And now we have tons of examples where it's not COVID aid money, it's not bills and legislation, or like I said, votes of confidence, bills of confidence, when we got to get money out the door because the government agenda has an imperative. And you're right, they are the ultimate house when it comes to questions of confidence. But bills like C-21, C-11, C-18, it's nice to name leaders from Indigenous communities in this place and the Prime Minister to take credit for it. But when we had C-11 and C-18 being debated in this place, the Broadcasting Act, and I had Indigenous groups saying we weren't consulted in the other place, it's important we stand up and we push back and we say to the government, you know what, wait a month, wait 6 months. We need to hear from other people as well. And the truth is, Senator Klein stood up during that time, and he made sure some of those groups were heard at committee. So credit to him. And there's many senators here at various times that are open-minded, push back against the government. But this is one of those times, colleagues, as well. When the government wants to move forward with draconian measures like the time allocation tool, which is a legitimate government tool, but yet a government wants to use it when they don't want to claim that they have government members in this chamber, it's an affront to the rules of this institution. And again, the government will find a way to get rulings and to beat around the rules and simply say, well, we have the majority, it doesn't matter. That is the worst thing. The worst thing, colleagues, you can say amongst yourselves, you can say in your various groups, or you can say, because you have the majority, we're going to ram it through. The moment that we curtail debate and we do not allow the minority voices to be heard, then we fall into a great deal of trap and risks. and we should not allow that to happen. The Salisbury Convention is fantastic. We use it to say, basically, we're an unelected body, like the House of Lords, so we should never challenge the government because they get elected. Well, the Salisbury Convention should also apply when the elected House overwhelmingly sends a bill to this place and says the country's in favor of it democratically, like Bill 234.
That's right.
So the Salisbury Act can only be something you invoke when it suits the government's interest. Say, well, it was in our agenda, C-21, we wanted to pass it. Well, the House of Commons is the ultimate expression of democracy in this house, in this parliament, in this country. And we, as an unelected body, ignore them, and we turn our back against it, and we say, well, the government wants this. Well, the parliament trumps government. The executive branch in this country gets its mandate from the elected House. And our job is to be an added value to hold the government to account. Nothing more, nothing less, and to be a voice for regions and voices that don't necessarily get heard in the other House. But colleagues, we have to be consistent, and it demands a lot of courage, because at the end of the day, you all get your independence from one thing: the fact that you're summoned here by a Prime Minister of Canada, and your nomination can never be revoked. So you can get ministers calling you, you can get the Prime Minister's office calling you, you can get the government leader / representative saying, this is important. If it doesn't get done by Christmas, it's going to fall apart. There will be no more sun in the sky. There's going to be all sorts of cajoling and pressure being put on each and every one of you by the Prime Minister that appointed you. That was the case since day one. That's how politics work. The Prime Minister that brought me here would put pressure on me. The Prime Minister that brought Percy down here, who was a lovely Liberal Prime Minister, would put pressure on him. But you know what? We're here now, and they're no longer here. And the Prime Minister that brought you here, let me tell you, he will be gone eventually.
Senator
but your
Housakos?
independence...
Senator Housakos? Senator Housakos?
Senatrice Miville-Dechene?
Senator Miville-Dechene on debate? Yes, perhaps on debate, because I think we don't have time for questions. On debate. Well, listen, Senator Housakos, I hear what you're saying, and I can't help myself from rising, because I think that you are living on a planet that does not exist. This idea that you are completely muzzled, that you can't speak. Well, we worked on bills. We worked on C-11. 6 months. 6 months of study. Do you think that you were prevented from inviting all of the witnesses that you wanted from over weeks? I'm thinking of C-18. I've been here for 5 years. This idea that the opposition can't do its work seems completely unrealistic to me. You are referring to a British system, to the House of Lords. In England, there are crossbenchers that exist. The independence is not a joke. Every day you tell us that we are Liberal senators, that we have no freedom. It's horrible. I can't deal with. I can't take it anymore. We are people with. I am not an agent of Prime Minister Trudeau. You keep repeating. Have you seen the number of amendments? The number of things that we've approved? It has nothing to do with what you're saying. Nothing. You are inventing a story. You are presenting yourself as a victim. But there are debates here. And frankly, I don't know. This image that you're giving us, I just can't. I can't anymore. We're not marionettes. We're not puppets. Well, I think I need to stop now.
Merry Christmas. The senators ready for the question? Is it your pleasure, honourable senators, to adopt the motion? Yes. Those in favor of the motion will please say yay. Yay. Those opposed to the motion will please say nay. Nay. I think the yays have it. In my opinion, the yays. I see two senators rising. Any advice on the length of the bell? 1 hour.
10:04.
So the order. So the vote will take place at 10:04. Call in the senators. Sitting. La question est la suivante.
The question is the following. The Honourable Senator Gold moved, seconded by the Honourable Senator Laboucan-Benson, that in accordance with pursuant to Rule 7.2, not more than a further 6 hours of debate be allocated at third reading stage of Bill C-21 dispense. All those in favour, please rise.
The Honourable Senator Gold, PC. The Honourable Senator Herder, PC. L'Honorable Sénatrice Benma. The Honourable Senator Francis. L'Honorable Sénateur Massicotte. The Honourable Senator Jaffe. The Honourable Senator Lankin, PC. The Honourable Senator Laboucan-Benson. L'Honorable Sénatrice Moncion. L'Honorable Sénatrice Dupuis. The Honourable Senator Tanis. The Honourable Senator Patterson, Ontario. L'Honorable Sénatrice Bernard CP. The Honourable Senator Cordy. L'Honorable Sénateur Dalphon. The Honourable Senator Klein. L'Honorable Sénateur Gignac. L'Honorable Sénatrice Miville Dechene. L'Honorable Sénateur Cormier. The Honourable Senator Moody. The Honourable Senator Duncan. The Honourable Senator Sorensen. The Honourable Senator Deakin, Nova Scotia. The Honourable Senator Smith. The Honourable Senator Osler. The Honourable Senator Bury. The Honourable Senator White. L'Honorable Sénatrice Gerba. The Honourable Senator Cardozo. L'Honorable Sénateur Forêt. The Honourable Senator Pettin. The Honourable Senator Beam. The Honourable Senator Kucher. The Honourable Senator Youssef. The Honourable Senator Quinn. The Honourable Senator Prosper. The Honourable Senator Down. L'Honorable Sénatrice Ringuette. L'Honorable Sénatrice Petitclerc. L'Honorable Sénatrice Saint-Germain. L'Honorable Sénatrice Clément. The Honourable Senator Omidvar. The Honourable Senator McFedrin. L'Honorable Sénatrice Mégy. The Honourable Senator Hartling. The Honourable Senator Cotter. The Honourable Senator Wu. The Honourable Senator Arnot. The Honourable Senator Lafreda. The Honourable Senator Coyle. The Honourable Senator Dasko. The Honourable Senator Ross. The Honourable Senator Kuzner. L'Honorable Sénateur Aucoin. The Honourable Senator Simons. The Honourable Senator Boniface. The Honourable Senator Ravaglia. The Honourable Senator Greenwood. The Honourable Senator Busson. The Honourable Senator Kingston.
All those opposed to the motion, please rise.
The Honourable Senator Plett. L'Honorable Sénateur Carignan CP. The Honourable Senator Martin. L'Honorable Sénateur Housakos. The Honourable Senator MacDonald. L'Honorable Sénateur Mockler. L'Honorable Sénatrice Poirier. The Honourable Senator Seidman. L'Honorable Sénateur Boisvenu. The Honourable Senator Marshall. The Honourable Senator Ataullahjan. The Honourable Senator Wells. The Honourable Senator O. The Honourable Senator Batters. The Honourable Senator Pate. The Honourable Senator Anderson. The Honourable Senator Wallen. The Honourable Senator Black. L'Honorable Sénateur Dechene.
All those who wish to abstain, please rise.
Yeas pour 60, 60. Nays contre 19, 19. Abstentions, abstention, aucun, nil.
Accordingly, the motion is adopted.
Bills, second reading, projet de loi, third reading, projet de loi, troisième lecture. Number 2, Bill C-21.
Senator Arnot.
Thank you, Speaker. Honourable Senators, I rise today to speak to Bill C-21. I thank our colleague, the Honourable Senator Youssef, for sponsoring this legislation in his usual comprehensive and professional fashion. I want to also thank Senator Dean for chairing and overseeing the hard work of the committee, and I thank both of them for encouraging thorough debate in this chamber on this bill. I'm going to address 4 issues. First, the failure of the federal government on the fiduciary duty. Second, failure to consult with key stakeholders affected by this legislation. The third, I believe, a fundamental flaw being that the bill does not create a legislative authority and discretion for the chief firearms officers in Canada to manage firearms in their jurisdiction. And fourth, a lack of policy and programs to ensure the goals of the Act are successful. Before I begin, I ask you to consider the nature of the rhetoric, the psychology, if you will, used in debates about this issue. First, let us consider the just one life argument, an argument that we must pass this bill even if it saves just one life. As a former human rights commissioner and as a former provincial court judge, I can tell you that the one-life argument does not hold in this country. It is not true in our hospitals where life and death decisions are made. It is not true in our country's highways, where speed limits minimize risk but do not eliminate it. It is not true in hockey rinks where injury, disability, and even death is established by actuaries. I'm not saying that hospitals, highways, and hockey rinks are similar to the concerns about illegal use of handguns or firearms. Unequivocally, every life matters equally. We must, however, dispense with false dilemma, false dichotomy arguments, logical fallacies that present two opposing options as the only possibilities when in fact more options exist. We must also ignore the "you're either with us or against us" mantra, a fallacy which oversimplifies issues and ignores the possibility of neutral or alternative positions, making it easier to sway opinion by presenting an either-or choice that is actually misleading. Colleagues, I know that we all stand and understand well the importance of persuasive discourse, in the chamber. Today, however, we must dispense with false narratives that Bill C-21 in its current form will effectively prevent deaths, harm, and crimes caused by firearms, and that there is no real choice but to pass Bill C-21 in its current form. We have to dispense with the false narrative that this bill is what victims and victims' families want and need. It is, alas, the only thing on offer, take it or leave it. As a provincial court judge, I presided over many gun crime offenses, and I can tell you that neither victims nor families want to be in a courtroom. They want the crime to have never taken place. They want never to have lost a loved one. Victims, groups, and advocates are quite rightly deeply invested in firearms legislation. They quite rightly want and deserve change, including assurances of safety and security in their homes, their schools, their communities, their mosques, their synagogues, and their places of worship. However, it is not a sign of respect to victims of violence to rubber stamp flawed legislation or legislation that will have limited outcomes. We need intentional, well-designed programs and policies that address the root causes of firearms violence that work in concert with solid legislation to save many lives. Bill C-21 as drafted will require our courtrooms to determine the impact of this legislation's ability not to save lives, but to pass judgment on those who violate or may have violated the law. Experience tells us that courtrooms offer lagging indicators and statistics, not measures of lives saved. Unequivocally, Canada needs legislation and measures to prevent firearms tragedies. Horrifying acts like those which occurred in Portapique in the northern community of La Loche, Saskatchewan, the shootings and murders at the Islamic Cultural Centre in Quebec City, the gender-based and misogynistic shootings and murders that took place at École Polytechnique. These tragedies tear at the hearts of Canadians and what it means to be a citizen in our democracy. We need legislation that protects the public good of public safety. It has been argued that C-21, in fact, is proactive legislation that will reduce crime by reducing guns that will make Canada a safer place. Is that true? Is it accurate? I answer this question with these remarks. I reiterate the words of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police as stated in the other place. The real issue, which is illegal firearms and illegal handguns obtained from the United States that have led to the disturbing current trend in gun violence that is largely related to gangs, street gangs, and more sophisticated organized crime groups. The City of Regina Chief of Police Evan Bray also said that restricting lawful handgun ownership will not meaningfully address the real issue. I reflect on the pages of observations generated through the witness testimony before the Senate Standing Committee. There was disappointment with the consultation process from Indigenous groups, for farmers, for hunters, for trappers, for ranchers, for sports shooters, and for collectors. It also disappointed researchers and even victims group advocates. Bill C-21 does not speak effectively to the needed policies and programs that respond to both domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and suicide. Canada needs sufficient psychologists, psychiatrists, doctors, and staff to ensure the well-being of our fellow citizens who are struggling with mental health issues. Canada needs public education about the fundamental civic responsibility to respect and preserve the safety and security of all citizens equally. Education that quashes white nationalism and other domestic threats. Unfortunately, Canada also needs more shelters for women and children escaping domestic violence, including our 2SL LGBTQI plus citizens, as well as removing firearms from such violence through effective gun ownership back checks. Colleagues, Canada is a very diverse country. We all know that what is required in urban Canada is not necessarily required in rural Canada. Chief firearms officers have a significant role to play in bridging that divide between rural and urban. Chief firearms officers are the people tasked with implementing much of the on-the-ground aspects of this legislation. And here is a key point in what I believe is missing in this legislation. The chief firearms officers of each province and territory should have the legislative authority, discretion, and tools to customize the implementation of this bill in their respective jurisdictions. They understand how to engage with municipalities, both rural and urban. Just 2 weeks ago in the province of Saskatchewan, the government signed a memorandum of understanding with the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan to promote firearm safety through education. The Chief Firearms Officer of Saskatchewan, Robert Freeberg, and the Chief Firearms Officer from Alberta, Dr. Terry Bryant, have demonstrated their effectiveness in creating necessary change through dialogue, stakeholder engagement, and public education. They operate models of excellence, yet they were shut out of providing any input whatsoever into the legislation, despite trying desperately. To be specific, I believe the Chief Firearms Officer of Saskatchewan is operating a professional, positive, pragmatic, proactive approach for all of Canada to emulate. Let us be clear, firearms safety is directly related to enforcement, and firearms enforcement is directly related to the investment of financial resources and to meaningful consultation with those affected by legislation. We have heard little to date about how the funding will work to meet the cost of implementing and enforcing this legislation. Without additional funding, chronically underfunded municipal and provincial police forces will not be successful in implementation without receiving specific dedicated new funds. The Assistant Commissioner of the RCMPF Division in Saskatchewan, Rhonda Blackmore, is short $20 million required to maintain just existing services in that province. There is an additional problem of recruitment facing all police forces in Canada. I've already spoken about how Bill C-21 is contrary to treaty and Indigenous rights. I'll only elaborate to say that the courts have cautioned the federal government against using the court system to solve problems. In the 1997 Delgamuukw decision, the Supreme Court of Canada specifically told the Government of Canada to work with First Nations proactively and in good faith. I recall Chief Justice Lemaire's admonition, and I paraphrase here, he said, "Don't keep coming back to the courts for a solution. The courts don't have the tools you need to find the solution. The issues require political solutions, which can only be found in a political forum." In other words, consultation, constructive dialogue, and a problem-solving ethos. On this bill, consultation did not occur with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. If meaningful consultations did not occur, how can we assess the merits of this bill, let alone support it? My fundamental concern is the Senate will be anointing the tyranny of the majority over the minority if it passes this legislation. This place, in this instant, right now, is the last bastion of protection for the rights of Indigenous people. I ask this question, if not now, when? If not you, Senators, who? Rights without respect, without enforcement, and without implementation are in fact meaningless. With this vote, take this opportunity to demonstrate that the Senate has the utmost respect for our Canadian Constitution when others apparently do not. One of the fundamental roles of the Senate is to protect minorities from the tyranny of the majority. Please live up to the expectation of your duty. The only effective way to compel the Cabinet is to reject this legislation. You have the power to use that tool now. The current government has less than 3 years left in its mandate. It is enough time to cure these flaws and to create the legislation that Canada really needs. Legislation is needed that is generated in compliance with the Constitution and necessarily incorporates all the advice and information and tools that are available. We have heard the government's explanations, but not its reasons for ignoring its responsibility. Why? Because there is no valid justification, no valid excuse for breaching the Constitution in the manner that's been demonstrated in the creation of this legislation. The most effective way to ensure the government responds to these omissions and breaches of the Constitution is to defeat this bill. Colleagues, in order for Canada's model of federalism to operate, the principles of collaboration, cooperation, and compromise are required. We need statesmanship from the leaders of the federal, provincial, and territorial governments. If any one of these governments create impediments to a constructive relationship, the result will impede the safety of Canadian citizens. As it stands, this bill, number one, is not founded on the meaningful consultation with legitimate rights holders, including treaty rights, Indigenous rights, and human rights. Secondly, it is not founded on meaningful consultation with those who have a legitimate work or workplace safety issue. 3, it is not founded on meaningful consultation with those who will enforce the legislation in each province and territory, especially chief firearms officers. 4, it is not based on the ability to target the guns that create gun crimes, the illegal guns that cross Canada's border. 5, it is not based on awareness and education measures that establish what it is that Canadians want, which is crime reduction and personal safety. 6, it does not address adequate funding to allow enforcement that will be effective. Do I believe Bill C-21 can be fixed? Yes. Do I believe that Bill C-21 needs to be fixed? Yes. Do I believe, as a chamber of sober second thought, that it is our responsibility to resolve the incongruity between what is being offered and what is needed? Yes. If Bill C-21's fundamental flaws were fixed, I would be its champion. However, Canada does not need or benefit from legislation that is based on placating and soothing promises that it is the best that we can do, that if you pass this bill, it will make things better, and promises of programs and policies that do not yet exist. Colleagues, let us not abdicate our responsibility on this issue. I support legislation that enables public safety, but I cannot support this particular legislation. I will vote against Bill C-21, and I invite you to do the same. Thank you.
Senator Anderson. Senator Anderson.
Madam Speaker and honourable senators, I rise in the Senate today to speak to Bill C-21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments for firearms. I want to acknowledge that today I speak from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Colleagues, I believe we share a common understanding of the urgency to tackle Canada's escalating problem of illicit firearms in circulation, especially concerning instances of intimate partner violence involving those dangerous weapons. My remarks today stem from the specific ramifications of certain sections within Bill C-21 rather than from a critique of the bill's overarching purpose. As an Inuk woman, I intimately understand the impact of federal legislation on our communities. Whether it aims to undermine our Indigenous identity or carries well-meaning intentions, legislation often poses risks to the North and Indigenous peoples when crafted without due consideration for our unique circumstances. It comes as no surprise that these concerns are evident within the fabric of Bill C-21. 3 primary concerns stemming from this bill encompasses, firstly, the critical role of the Chief Firearms Officer and their primary resident outside the territory that they represent. Number 2, a lack of meaningful consultation. And number 3, the red flag provisions. In 1972, Chief Dan George said, "Let no one forget it. We are a people with special rights guaranteed to us by promises and treaties. We do not beg for these rights, nor do we thank you. We do not thank you for them because we paid for them. And the price we paid was exorbitant. We paid for them with our culture, our dignity, and our self-respect. We paid until we became a beaten race, poverty-stricken and conquered." It's ironic that my initial plea isn't about seeking special treatment, but rather advocating for equality, aiming to grant the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut the same rights as all 9 Canadian provinces. Canada's Arctic and Northern Policy Framework rightly highlights the long-standing disparity faced by the Arctic and Northern residents, particularly Indigenous communities, in accessing services, opportunities, and living standards comparable to other Canadians. Bill C-21 serves as a stark example of this disparity. Notably, the Chief Firearms Officers, or CFOs, for the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut are located in Surrey, British Columbia, Edmonton, Alberta, and Winnipeg, Manitoba, respectively. This arrangement starkly contrasts with the provincial setup, where each CFO operates within their respective province. This discrepancy emphasizes the fact that all 3 territorial CFOs are situated in the southern regions, amplifying the ongoing lack of equitable access and representation for Arctic and Northern communities, especially Indigenous peoples. According to testimony from Nathan Obed, President of Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, on November 6, 2023, before the Standing Senate Committee on National Security, Defence and Veterans Affairs, who stated, Clause 70.3's provisions allowing for a conditional license is not guaranteed, but rather subject to the discretion of the CFO. This is not an equitable measure, particularly when considering the geographical and logistical barriers Inuit face when accessing CFOs. The officer responsible for Nunavut, for example, is located in Winnipeg. The distance is more than geographical. It is cultural and practical. We must ask whether such officials can adequately assess and understand the unique circumstances and necessities of Inuit hunters. My attempt to propose an amendment in committee requiring Chief Firearms Officers to reside and operate within their designated territory unfortunately failed. As legislators responsible for sober second thought, it seems crucial that we address the persisting inequalities and disparities within Canada. Why is it that while the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut are subject to the same legislation as the rest of Canada, they lack commensurate access to services and support provided to the 9 provinces? I note that subsequently, the Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions, and Intergovernmental Affairs, Dominique LeBlanc, has written a letter to all 3 territorial premiers regarding the potential appointment of resident CFOs in each territory. While this is promising, I believe that there is a moral and legal obligation that must be addressed by the immediate placement of CFOs in all 3 territories. Anything less than this corrective action is unacceptable and represents a failure of Canada's duties. Secondly, I emphasize once more the continual absence of lack of meaningful consultation with Indigenous peoples, echoing an alarming and recurrent pattern evident in prior legislation. This repetition persists ad nauseum, despite the existence of Section 35, the United Nations Declarations of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the calls to action by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and Canada's persistent commitment to reconciliation, including the affirmation of meaningful consultation. I note that the Northwest Territories population is 49.6%. Nunavut is 85.9%, and the Yukon is 22.3%. The lack of consultation is particularly concerning as the rights of Indigenous people to hunt is asserted and affirmed in Section 35 and historic and modern treaties, as well as land claim agreements. In a 1974 journal article entitled Inuit Hunting Rights in the Northwest Territories, it states, "The Inuit culture and identity are based upon an intimate relationship with the lands and waters they have traditionally occupied and used. Hunting for food and clothing is part of their traditional and continuing culture. Their lands and waters are an integral part of their total being. Few Canadians realize that many Inuit are experiencing within a single lifetime a tremendous cultural transformation for that of a food-gathering tribal community to an industrial society. Therefore, the preservation of Inuit hunting rights has the effect of enhancing their cultural identity in a rapidly changing society. The present economic benefits of hunting will be increasingly incidental to the cultural aspect rooted in thousands of years as a hunting people. The protection of Inuit hunting rights can be viewed as a mechanism to preserve Inuit culture without cost to the rest of Canadian society." This statement is just as true 49 years later, where subsistence hunting is central to not just our identity, but our survival. Hunting, and thus guns, remain central to our ability to address food insecurity and high costs of living. Guns are also a necessity to ensure our safety from predatory animals in and outside our communities. According to witness testimony from Mr. Paul Arnot, Vice President of Nunavut Incorporated on November 8, 2023, there has not been sufficient consultation on the bill. We understand that Inuit Tapiri Kanatami, the National Inuit Organization commonly known as ITK, had received a briefing of the most recent version of the bill shortly before it was tabled in May. However, neither ITK nor NTI has been fully consulted on the language and impacts of this bill. Additionally, I reiterate the viewpoint expressed by my colleague, Senator Don Plett, in the Chamber. On November 6 of 2023, on Bill C-21, during witness testimony in relation to consultation, Mr. David, Director of Legal Counsel with Inuit Tapiriat Kanatami, stated, "Put simply, there was none. The minister had reached out and offered, and we reached out and requested, but that consultation never occurred. We're still waiting." I share that sentiment. I'm still waiting for Canada to honour and uphold their commitments to Indigenous people. Despite my role as a senator and the numerous opportunities and privileges afforded to me as a parliamentarian, I am constantly reminded I am an Inuk woman in a place whose history has deeply influenced and molded not just myself, but also my family, community, and generations of Inuit in immeasurable, harmful, and profound ways. Parliamentarians should be deeply concerned when Canada consistently passes legislation without meaningful consultation, despite the presence of crucial frameworks like UNDRIP, Section 35, and the TRC calls to action, alongside Canada's explicit commitment to reconciliation. This ongoing disregard for meaningful consultation undermines the integrity of the legislative process and contradicts Canada's pledges to uphold Indigenous rights, respect Indigenous sovereignty, and engage in a genuine reconciliation process. Such actions perpetuate systematic inequalities, erode trust, and disregard the voices and rights of Indigenous peoples, hindering the nation's progress towards genuine reconciliation and equitable governance. This brings me to the new red flags provisions, which would allow for a person to make an ex parte application to a provincial court judge for an order that would allow for search and seizures of firearms with or without a warrant. According to Mr. Thurley, firearms research and policy specialist, the ill-considered red flag proposals are also problematic. Under Canada's existing licensing system, police and judges already have the power to remove guns and revoke licenses from those who pose a threat. The new provisions have no requirements to consider Indigenous hunting rights, for the complaint to have any relationship to the accused, or for the accused to be heard in court. Indigenous people are disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system and are also the most reliant on firearms for subsistence. We will undermine the built-in safeguards of the existing red flag law. Where people hunt to feed family, this has real consequences. Mr. Thurley also highlighted a critical concern: the anonymity of complaints and sealed court records could potentially render the system susceptible to false, trivial, or vexatious complaints against prominent figures, including law enforcement officers and military personnel. For Indigenous Canadians already overrepresented in the justice system, navigating this process to reclaim firearms unjustly confiscated could prove exceptionally challenging. According to Nathan Obed, president of ITK, the red flag system is another example of a balanced measure that creates a mechanism that can disrupt Inuit households disproportionately. Inuit often live in multi-generational homes, thus the seizure of firearms could have unintended repercussions on an entire family, not just the individuals targeted by provisions of the bill. The confidential nature of the application process and the prospect that target of the application or their household wouldn't even know about the application could also lead to actions being taken without adequate notice or understanding of a family's circumstances. On the other hand, the limited access to justice faced by Inuit also means the applications themselves would likely be hampered simply by the fact the Inuit may not be able to apply in the first instance. In the Northwest Territories, 21 out of the 33 communities are accessible only by fly-in, and in Nunavut, all 25 communities are solely accessible via air travel. The remoteness and lack of infrastructure in these regions result in significant portions of the territories relying on fly-in courts where judges, lawyers, Crown Counsel, legal aid, and court staff operate. These fly-in court sessions occur every 2 to 3 months, but are susceptible to postponements or cancellations due to adverse weather or unforeseen circumstances. For Indigenous peoples in these territories, accessibility remains restricted, not only due to the reliance on fly-in courts, but also because the majority of lawyers are accessed through legal aid. In regard to the red flag provisions, Mr. David stated, "I suppose the system itself presumes that there are police to enforce it. Yes, it also presumes that there are effective provincial courts available in the community at all times. There's a real challenge there in terms of whether or not someone seeking an order has access to the means to be able to do it. From the perspective of trying to prevent violence, the red flag system itself may not be entirely helpful within all communities within Inuit Nunangat. On top of that, it allows for one to apply for an ex parte order so you can have police where the red flag system is available, showing up unannounced to seize firearms from people who are not aware that those police are showing up to seize those firearms. The entire system itself seems to be set up to work well in areas where there's a lot of legal enforcement infrastructure. The problem here is that we don't perceive that there is adequate infrastructure to actually make the provisions effective, either for community safety or for the delicate balance that the legislation seeks to strike between essentially Section 35 rights holders and harvesters, and then victims or potential victims of domestic violence. For these reasons, the implications of the red flag provisions pose some very real logistical challenges to the three territories, especially in light of the lack of meaningful consultations, and the fact that no amendments were adopted despite the testimony of witnesses heard within the Standing Committee on National Security, Defence and Veteran Affairs.
Senator, I'm sorry, the time allowed for debate has expired. Are you asking for a few more minutes? Is leave granted? Senator Anderson.
Even with Minister LeBlanc's recent efforts addressing the deficiencies in Bill C-21 concerning Indigenous peoples and Northern Canada, my hopefulness remains tempered by the ongoing uncertainties about the sincere implication of impactful measures to narrow the support gap for Indigenous peoples, the three territories, and the disparities amongst province and territories. It's imperative for Canada to recognize Indigenous peoples as active collaborators in the legislative process, not just merely as its subjects. According to President Nathan Obed, the rights affirmed by UNDRIP can only be implemented if they are interpreted as legal rights and implemented and enforced accordingly. Our human rights are not second-class rights and deserve the same protection as the other rights of Canadians. Thank you.
Senator Coyle. Honourable Senators, I rise today on the unceded lands of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation to speak at third reading on Bill C-21, a bill that aims to build on existing national gun control legislation and other measures designed to build a safer Canada for all of us. Colleagues, Sunday marked the conclusion of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, and last week we marked our National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. And here we are tonight, considering a violence prevention bill. This important and long-awaited legislation has more than one purpose. Bill C-21 is aimed at reducing and preventing gun violence we are seeing in cities, often perpetrated by gangs. It's aimed at preventing further mass tragedies, such as the one experienced in my province in 2020, as well as the Quebec City mosque massacre targeting Muslims and the École Polytechnique massacre targeting women. Bill C-21 is aimed at addressing violence against women, all forms of gender-based violence and family violence in rural and urban areas. Finally, it aims to reduce devastating incidents of self-harm and suicide. Colleagues, we often feel smug living next to our gun-toting American neighbors to the south, where there are 400 million civilian firearms owned, and tragically, where gun violence and mass shootings have reached epidemic proportions. But colleagues, Canada has one of the highest rates of gun ownership among industrialized countries, and we are fourth among the 38 OECD countries in the rate of firearm death, and we have the third highest rate of firearm homicide among populous high-income countries after the US and Chile. Bill C-21 will, and I'll explain what it's going to do, bring in a national handgun freeze. This is not a ban. There will be no confiscation of legally owned handguns. The number of legally owned handguns has grown since 2006 from 360,000 to over 1 million, owned by 275,000 Canadians. Second, it brings a new prospective, not retroactive, definition of assault-style weapon characteristics. Hunters will not lose their guns. It is estimated that there are 7 to 8 million rifles and shotguns owned by 2.5 million Canadians. It introduces red flag and yellow flag laws with the purpose of reducing and preventing family violence, intimate partner violence, self-harm, and suicide. It has measures to strengthen border control, to prevent firearms smuggling and trafficking, and requiring a firearms license in order to import ammunition. The bill includes measures to address illegally manufactured guns done through 3D printing, often referred to as ghost guns. It introduces new firearms-related offenses and strengthens penalties. Colleagues, at its most basic, the expectation is that over time, this bill will reduce or at least cap the number of guns circulating in Canada, and thus reduce the opportunities for gun-related death and harm in our society. So, colleagues, those are the basics. Senator Youssef already provided us with far more detail on the bill and its key components. Colleagues, unfortunately, some of our fellow Canadians have been misled on some aspects of the bill, and frankly, on some of the broader issues around guns, gun-related crimes, gun control legislation, and gun rights in Canada. The area of misinformation, and in some cases intentional disinformation, is one I would like to probe a little in my remarks on Bill C-21 today. I believe it's important to understand some of the powerful influences at play here. We've seen cases of misinformation and disinformation in relation to other important societal matters, ones we've discussed in this chamber, related to COVID, climate change, and more recently to the rights of LGBTQ children and youth. These are a threat to our democracy. It's very important for all Canadians to understand that, as Justice Peter Corey said in R. Blake Brown's Firearms Rights in Canada, Law and History in the Debates Over Gun Control, and I quote, "Canadians, unlike Americans, do not have a constitutional right to bear arms. Indeed," he continued, "most Canadians prefer the peace of mind and sense of security derived from the knowledge that the possession of automatic weapons is prohibited." Some disinformation circulating suggests that Bill C-21 will ban hunting guns and that potentially all guns could be banned by the bill. Rick Egerich, National President of the Canadian Firearms Association, said, and I quote, "This is one of the worst attacks against rights and freedoms and livelihoods and property in Canadian history." Bill C-21. Although the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights claim that it is, in fact, anti-gun lobbyists who are spreading false rumors about American involvement in Canadian gun lobbies, two recent Bloomberg articles draw some concerning connections with the U.S. government, the American firearms industry, the NRA, and other U.S. gun lobbies and their counterparts in countries like Canada. In the first Bloomberg article, entitled "NRA-Style Politics Transform Canada's Gun Culture," and shootings rose 869%, the authors wrote, and I quote, "The NRA helped the homegrown Canadian Sports Shooting Association set up a political arm to battle the expanded rule in these, at that time, the long gun registry. The American organization also coached the Canadian group's members in grassroots advocacy to promote pro-gun candidates in the 2006 election." I continue the Bloomberg article. "Over the past 2 decades, the annual volume of U.S.-made semi-automatic firearm imports into Canada has increased almost tenfold. During this period, the annual number of crimes fell slightly, while the number of violent crimes remained fairly flat, yet firearms-related crimes more than doubled. And shootings increased 869% from 219 in 2003 to 2,123 in 2022. In January, the U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives disclosed for the first time that of the almost 25,000 Canadian Canadian crime guns, it traced from Of the almost 25,000 Canadian crime guns, it traced from 2017 to 2021. 1 in 3 had been legally imported from the U.S. The Bloomberg article continues. The NRA says its quiet diplomacy makes it the world's most influential firearm advocate. James Baranowski, the organization's Director of International Affairs, cited the Canadian debate over Trudeau's policies while addressing the group's January 2021 board meeting. He said the NRA's efforts are often in the shadows, but the results can be seen and heard around the world. In the second Bloomberg article entitled "U.S. Gun Exports Surge, Fueling Violence Around the World," the authors indicate that to fuel its overseas push, the U.S. firearms industry, through its political allies, has managed to weaken gun control laws and seed pro-gun advocacy in other countries. They state that the U.S. government has helped push international sales of rapid-fire guns to record levels. Canada is a top customer. The U.S. Commerce Department has played a booster role in the firearms industry, even as America's mass shootings horrify the world and gun crime rates rise in many of the important countries. Sig Sauer, a successful U.S.-based firearms exporter, has donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to the NRA and the U.S. National Shooting Sports Foundation, and in 2016 donated $100,000 to #GunVote, a super PAC that heavily supported former President Donald Trump. Now, in the Canadian media, the Walrus magazine published an article in September 2021 entitled "Why Gun Rights Advocates Partner with Islamophobic Groups." The article outlined how a then field officer for the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights, Colin Saunders, spoke on the podium at an event on Parliament Hill sponsored by Canadian Combat Coalition, or C3, a known anti-Muslim hate group.
He stood and said, "I'm proud to stand up here with a bunch of real Canadians who stand for real values." Linkages between guns and white supremacists have been identified in both the U.S. and Canada. Gifford's Law Center has an interesting article on how America's gun laws fuel armed hate. And Time magazine in May 2022 published an article entitled, "White Supremacy is Deadly. Guns Make It Deadlier." In a 2019 Maclean's magazine article, Dr. Pam Palmater wrote, "Guns and white supremacy don't mix." Colleagues, we know that definitely not all members of Canadian firearms rights organizations are heavily influenced by the U.S. gun lobby, and that most gun owners in Canada are certainly not predisposed to be members of hate groups. We do, however, know that hate groups and their members tend to own and amass stashes of weapons, and that makes them more dangerous, and we know that academics are beginning to trace connections between extreme right-wing and white supremacist groups and the gun lobby. We also know that some members of the Canadian gun lobby are employing NRA-style intimidation and silencing strategies on those in Canada calling for greater gun control. Dr. Najma Ahmed, a Toronto doctor who treated some of the victims of the Danforth shooting and a member of Canadian Doctors for Protection from Guns, was targeted by the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights. The CCFR encouraged their social media followers to file complaints against Dr. Ahmed with the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. The doctor was also told to "stay in your lane, doctor," reminiscent of what the NRA had told the American College of Physicians to do a few months earlier after ACP issued a paper framing gun violence as a public health issue. R. Blake Brown, Canada's foremost historian on gun control, said, and I quote, "In the 1970s, there weren't a lot of Canadian gun groups. They were mostly hunting groups that adamantly rejected being labeled as lobbies. But times have changed. Canadians who once rejected the idea that they were somehow affiliated or influenced by the NRA in the 1970s are now more willing to adopt some of those ideas." Of course, there was no social media in the 1970s. Colleagues, it really does come down to what kind of society we want to live in and leave for future generations. Our proximity to the U.S. and this age of powerful social media influence makes our job as legislators and the jobs of all who want a Canada safe from gun violence all the more difficult and complex. We know that countries like Australia and the United Kingdom and Japan have implemented more comprehensive gun control measures than Canada, and these countries have achieved lower rates of firearm-related deaths and mass shootings compared to Canada. The UK banned handguns following the Dunblane school massacre in Scotland in 1997. There have been no school shootings and one mass shooting event since 1997 in the UK. Bill C-21 passed without amendments at committee. Colleagues, we know this bill is not perfect, but I believe it takes several important steps to respond to the recommendations of the Nova Scotia Mass Casualty Commission, the Renfrew County Inquest, and to the pleas of the mass shooting victim groups Police se souvient, Danforth Families for Safe Communities, and Centre Culturel Islamique de Québec. Honourable colleagues, in conclusion, I support Bill C-21 and its measures designed to safeguard Canadians from gun violence in all its forms. Colleagues, life, after all lives, are precious gifts. Let's pass this, what I consider sensible gun control bill, which, as the evidence demonstrates, is designed to protect and to save lives. Honourable colleagues, Canadians want a safer Canada. Let's take this important step while at the same time continuing to insist on much more. Thank you, colleagues. Walalio. Merci.
Are senators ready for the question? Is it your pleasure, honourable senators? I'm sorry, Senator Dasko. Senator Dasko, you have the floor. Senator Dasko.
Thank you, Speaker.
Honourable Senators, I rise today to speak at third reading to Bill C-21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments firearms. This bill enacts substantial changes and reforms to the Criminal Code and to the Firearms Act dealing with firearms. The Minister of Public Safety introduced this bill at first reading on May the 30th of 2022. The bill made its way here on May 18th of this year and was sent to our Standing Senate Committee on National Security and Defense on June the 21st. Our committee held 12 meetings on C-21 and heard 66 witnesses. Led by our chair, Senator Dean, the process was thorough and extensive. We covered the issues well. Our committee reported back with no amendments but an extensive list of observations. I feel that our work is done, and I feel that our work was done well. This important bill takes its rationale from crime statistics as well as the growth in numbers of guns in this country. In his second reading speech introducing the bill on June the 9th of 2022, Minister Mendicino cited a 2022 Stats Canada report, which in his words shows, and I quote, gun violence is up 81% since 2009. Gun homicides are up. Handgun violence specifically is up, and this is the #1 type of gun used in homicides. Alarmingly, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and gender-based violence are all up in connection with the presence of guns and gun violence, end quote. Others cite the rise in the number of guns itself as justification for the measures in the bill. For example, Senator Youssef, in his sponsor's speech here, noted an increase in the prevalence of handguns in Canada. Between 2010 and 2020, he noted, the number of handguns increased by 74% to 1 million handguns owned by approximately 275,000 individuals in this country. There is a theory here about the increase in guns, and the theory goes as follows. The more guns we find in a society, the more harms we find that involve guns. And that harm is found not just in gun crime, but in other harms such as suicide and misuse and accidents. And as a corollary to this theory, reducing the number of guns will reduce these harms. Fewer guns means fewer harms. If we need proof of this theory, all we have to do is to look south of the border to see the magnitude of killings and deaths attributable to the abundance of guns and the ideology of gun ownership run wild. We in this country will never accept the gun dystopia, which is the United States of America. So, C-21 tackles the central issue of limiting the availability of guns in several ways. There is a handgun freeze. C-21 would implement a national freeze on the sale, purchase, transfer, and importation of handguns. This is not the handgun ban that some people were seeking, and none of the handguns owned by legal license holders will be confiscated. But over time, this freeze will limit the numbers of handguns in this country. And then there is the problem of assault-style weapons. In 2020, by order in council, the government prohibited a list of approximately 1,500 makes and models of assault-style firearms. This bill adds another measure to deal with the assault guns by prohibiting future assault-style firearms from entering the Canadian market. Again, this approach does not go as far as some would like, since it does not deal with the other makes and models that are currently held by Canadians. The government proposes to set up a council to identify these firearms, which might then be subject to a ban. So again, looking down the road, these measures should help to reduce assault-style firearms in this country. And then there are the so-called ghost guns, the firearms or firearm parts that can be manufactured, which have proliferated in recent years. Bill C-21 will create new offenses aimed at the use of 3D printing for manufacturing and trafficking of firearms, and will classify ghost guns and other illegally made firearms as prohibited. These provisions relating to handguns, assault-style weapons, and ghost guns, if all implemented, will limit the number of guns in this country going forward. Two other parts of the bill are extremely important in my view. Bill C-21 addresses intimate partner violence and gender-based violence by enacting red flag and expanded license revocation laws. The new red flag law would enable anyone to apply to a court to remove firearms for up to 30 days from a person who may pose a danger to themselves or others. A longer-term prohibition, up to 5 years, is possible if there continue to be reasonable grounds to believe that the individual poses a risk. In addition, a firearms license could be revoked from someone in cases of domestic violence or criminal harassment, i.e. stalking, when a protection order has been issued against a license holder or when a red flag order is issued. There's much more in C-21, but for me, these are the key points. Now, of course, this bill is very far from perfect. And I have to say I was surprised and very disappointed to see some of the serious missteps the government made along the way. We heard last week and in committee about the lack of adequate consultation with Indigenous groups and others, such as chief firearms officers, in the process of drafting the bill. We heard about unresolved issues, including those involving handgun shooting sports. And many of us recall the introduction of amendments back in November 2022 involving a long list of assault-style firearms which were to be prohibited. This resulted in a storm of protest from hunters and farmers who claimed that hunting guns were also on that list. And thus, the government ended up withdrawing this list that they had put forward in February of this year. This, I feel, was a setback in the effort to limit assault-style weapons in this country. But still, C-21 is very worthy of our support. I am very impressed that the bill has gained approval from such a wide range of experts, academics, health researchers, activists, and law enforcement agencies. Here are some examples of the supporters: the Canadian Association of Emergency Physicians, Canadian Doctors for Protection from Guns, Canadian Pediatric Society, Coalition for Gun Control, Danforth Families for Safe Communities, Families of Dawson, National Association of Women in the Law, the Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec City, Police se souvient, Regroupement des Maisons pour Femmes Victimes de Violences Conjugales, and Women's Shelters Canada, just an example of some of the many stakeholders who support this. For example, Dr. Wendy Suk here, speaking for the Coalition for Gun Control, which represents over 200 health, crime prevention, policing, and women's organizations, stated, and I quote, "We are asking that you pass this legislation in its current form." Excuse me. Dr. Najma Ahmed, Professor of Surgery, Trauma, and Emergency Surgery, University of Toronto, speaking for the Canadian Doctors for Protection from Guns, stated, and I quote, "Canada needs Bill C-21. It will save lives." Natalie Provost, spokesperson for Police se souvient, which represents survivors of the December 6th femicides at École Polytechnique, stated, and I quote, "Today we urge you pass Bill C-21 without amendments as quickly as possible. It is a good bill. It is not perfect and not complete, but it freezes handgun sales and helps protect women from domestic murders. It will save lives." And she also said, and I quote, "We feel it is absolutely essential to pass the bill so we can move forward. For us, the bill is very valuable." And also Dr. Natasha Saunders, physician, Hospitals for Sick Children, speaking for the Canadian Pediatric Society, who stated, and I quote, "As an organization, we support the passage of Bill C-21. Colleagues, I also want to note the endorsement for C-21 among law enforcement officials. I must admit that I was surprised by this initially and was expecting more criticism from them. But Deputy Chief Bill Forty, whom we've heard about before, earlier remarks, speaking on behalf of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, told our committee that, and I quote, the CACP supports Bill C-21 in principle and believes this law is introducing essential provisions to the Criminal Code and the Firearms Act, end quote. And he also said, and I quote, I think it is helpful rather than hurtful. I think the stronger language around prohibited firearms is helpful. I think the efforts to reduce domestic violence are helpful. As the previous witnesses referenced, the fatality attached to some of those incidents. And he is the chief law enforcement witness that we had at committee. He represents the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police. His sentiments were echoed by other law enforcement witnesses, including Fiona Wilson, Deputy Chief Constable, Vancouver Police Department, who stressed that the bill is positive and gives police additional tools in many areas. However, on the other side, I think everyone in this chamber understands that well-organized groups have lobbied hard against it, and Senator Coyle has mentioned some of the groups. In my case, I've counted over 2,000 pieces of correspondence since we got the bill in May here in the Senate. And the vast majority of the correspondence are from groups opposed to this bill. And their presence on social media is huge. But how representative are these opposing views? Well, it turns out these views are not very representative at all. I decided to commission a public opinion survey about key aspects of the bill. The national survey found that the vast majority of Canadians, in fact, support stricter gun control. There is no doubt about it. 73% of Canadians support, and I quote, freezing the sale, purchase, transport, and importation of handguns. 85% of Canadians support prohibiting new assault-style firearms from entering the Canadian market. And over 90% each support the red flag provisions, that is, allowing firearms to be removed by court order from a firearm owner who may possess a danger to themselves or others. And 96% of Canadians support the ability to remove a firearms license from someone in cases where there's been domestic violence or criminal harassment. A majority of Canadians across all regions, both genders, but particularly women, men too, but particularly women, and all age categories support all four of these measures. Colleagues, these are not the elites that we have heard about. These are the views of ordinary Canadians. So let's be very clear about it. Canadians are saying yes to stronger gun controls and yes to the key provisions of Bill C-21. And also, by approving C-21, this country will take another important step away from the destructive gun culture and away from the ubiquitous gun violence of our neighbor to the south. Colleagues, I will be voting for this bill. I hope you will too. Thank you very much.
Senator Batters, you have a question or on debate? You have a question? Senator Dasko, will you take a question?
Oh, yes.
Senator Batters.
Who is the question coming?
Thank you. The poll that you spoke about, how much did that poll cost, and did you pay for it out of your Senate budget?
The poll, yes. Thank you, Senator, for your question. The poll cost $3,400. I did pay for it from my Senate budget. That has to be the best $3,400 I have ever spent. I can't believe that you can consult Canadians. I can't believe you can actually consult Canadians for a fee of $3,400 on a bill like this, and you can ask substantial questions, and whatever the result is, in any case, what a deal that was, that $3,400.
Are senators ready for the question? Is it your pleasure, honourable senators, to adopt the motion? Those in favor of the motion will please say yay. Yay. Those opposed to the motion will please say nay. Nay. I think the yeas have it. I see 2 senators rise. Any advice on the length of the bell? I'm sorry. Thank you. So pursuant to Rule 745C, the vote is deferred until 5:30 on the next sitting day. The question is as follows. It was moved by the Honourable Senator Youssef, seconded by the Honourable Senator Duncan, that Bill C-21 enact to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments, firearms, to be read a third time. All those in favour of the motion will please rise.
The Honourable Senator Gold, PC. The Honourable Senator Harder, PC. The Honourable Senator Francis. The Honourable Senator Jaffer. The Honourable Senator Laboucan-Benson. L'Honorable Sénatrice Motion. L'Honorable Sénatrice Dupuis. The Honourable Senator Pate. The Honourable Senator Patterson, Ontario. The Honourable Senator Green. The Honourable Senator Cordy. L'Honorable Senator Dalphon. The Honourable Senator Klein. L'Honorable Senator Gignac. L'Honorable Sénatrice Miville-Dechene. L'Honorable Sénateur Cormier. L'Honorable Sénatrice Galvez. The Honourable Senator Moody. The Honourable Senator Sorensen. The Honourable Senator Deakin, Nova Scotia. The Honourable Senator Smith. The Honourable Senator Osler. The Honourable Senator Bury. The Honourable Senator Bernard. L'Honorable Sénatrice Gerba. The Honourable Senator Cardozo. L'Honorable Sénateur Faure. The Honourable Senator Petton. The Honourable Senator Beam. The Honourable Senator Kuchar. The Honourable Senator Youssef. The Honourable Senator Quinn. The Honourable Senator Prosper. L'Honorable Senateur Dechene. L'Honorable Sénatrice Ringuette. L'Honorable Sénatrice Petitclerc. L'Honorable Sénatrice Saint-Germain. L'Honorable Sénatrice Clément. The Honourable Senator Omidvar. The Honourable Senator McFedrin. L'Honorable Sénatrice Meiji. The Honourable Senator Hartling. The Honourable Senator Cotter. The Honourable Senator Wu. The Honourable Senator Lafreda. The Honourable Senator Coyle. The Honourable Senator Dasko. The Honourable Senator Ross. The Honourable Senator Kuzner. L'Honorable Sénateur Aucoin. The Honourable Senator Simons. The Honourable Senator Boyer. The Honourable Senator Dean. The Honourable Senator Boniface. The Honourable Senator Ravaglia. The Honourable Senator Busson. The Honourable Senator Deacon, Ontario. The Honourable Senator Kingston. The Honourable Senator McNair. The Honourable Senator McCollum.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
The Honourable Senator Plett. L'Honorable Senator Carignan CP. The Honourable Senator Martin. L'Honorable Senator Housakos. The Honourable Senator MacDonald. The Honourable Senator Arnot. L'Honorable Senatrice Poirier. The Honourable Senator Seidman. L'Honorable Senator Boisvenu. The Honourable Senator Marshall. The Honourable Senator Ataullahjan. The Honourable Senator Greenwood. The Honourable Senator Wells. The Honourable Senator O. The Honourable Senator Batters. L'Honorable Senator Massicat. The Honourable Senator Tanis. L'Honorable Senatrice Vernel CP. The Honourable Senator Anderson. The Honourable Senator Duncan. The Honourable Senator Patterson-Nunavut. The Honourable Senator Wallen. The Honourable Senator Black. The Honourable Senator Richards.
All those who wish to abstain will please rise.
Yeas pour 60, nays contre 24, 24, abstentions, abstention, aucun, nil.
En conséquence,
accordingly, the motion is adopted.
Third reading of this bill, troisième lecture de ce projet de loi.
Ordered that a message be sent to the House of Commons to acquaint that House that the Senate has passed this bill without amendment.
Perfect.